Okay, so today we're on our fourth ox herding picture, which is catching the ox. And to catch those of you up who haven't been before, I'm in the midst of a series of 10 talks, which correspond with the stages of a spiritual practice as they're presented in a pretty famous series of images and poems that present the investigation and the mastery of the true self, and it presents that journey as a process of taming or herding one's ox. So the ox is a metaphor for your true self, and then we go through these stages of seeing it, or I should say, setting off on the search for it, seeing the footprints, seeing the ox, catching the ox, taming the ox, et cetera, et cetera. So we're at the fourth stage right now, which is catching the ox. It's a very exciting stage and a very dynamic stage. Are we good with microphone? Is it? Are we just going to go with the microphone here? That's
Yeah, because it doesn't pick it up otherwise.
Doesn't pick it up otherise.
Yeah, so it's our only option.
So it's really just for show.
Well, we don't even have it here. So
Yeah. It has been just for show.
Yeah.
All right. So we're on catching the ox, which is the fourth stage. The previous three stages were seeking out, looking for the ox, and then seeing the footprints, and then seeing the ox. So now we've actually got our hands on it. The verse that goes with this, I'm going to say two different translations of this. Advancing with difficulty, the ox's nose is pierced, but this fiery nature is hard to control. Dragged here and there, you stray through cloud-covered forests. There's another version. Through extraordinary effort, you seize the ox. Still, its will is forceful and its body spirited. Sometimes it runs high into the mountains. Other times it disappears into the mist. So very, very interesting and intriguing stage that we're at right here with our glimpse, our first real experiential taste of true nature. I like to look at the emotional tone qualities of these different stages as they're presented in this progression. And this one is spirited, effortful. There's even a struggle going on as we meet our true self for the first time in a deeply experiential way. The tone qualities of the prior stages, in the first stage, we were confused. By we, I mean the seeker. We're confused, even desperate. In the second stage, it was adventurous and even exposed and vulnerable as we saw those footprints and we knew we were onto something. And then third stage, when we actually see the ox for the first time, we get a glimpse of our true nature. It was actually surprisingly peaceful and relieved and inquisitive. And now we come to actually tasting it, touching it. And we've got this very dynamic place of struggle and wrestling with this power that we've touched into. I want to keep this to the fore, this quality. So this whole, even just in the first four stages, you can see what a roller coaster the spiritual journey is. You know, it's not this path of pacification at all. You know, it's quite dramatic. It's quite alive. It's quite vibrant. It's full of twists and turns. It's full of strong emotion all through. So what is this catching? When we say we're catching the ox. So this is where we gain a rudimentary understanding of the nature of true self. I've talked before about another way to look at spiritual practice in terms of these stages of view, understanding, manifestation, integration, and realization. I think there may be some value in seeing the path this way. This is what the Oxford pictures are talking about, this process of deepening, maturing, and developing. View, you see it, see your true nature. Understanding, you get it. And then manifestation is you start to embody it in your life. Integration, you really integrate your whole life with it. And realization, you become it. Okay? So we're going to talk about those 3 stages later on, but now we're in understanding. That's where we are with our 4th stage. We get it. We get it in our body. We get it in our lives. So there's a difference between seeing it and getting it, right? You probably have examples in your own life. You know, you can hear something and sort of understand the words, but not necessarily understand in your body what somebody is saying experientially. An example that came to me as I was putting this together is that you can watch Lionel Messi, who's one of the best soccer players in the world. You can watch him do an amazing thing. You can see it, and you can see just the brilliance of that. But it's another thing to actually make that kind of move out on the soccer field. And not that I would ever be able to make a move that Lionel Messi makes, but to make a move, a good move that really, you feel it, you get it. You know, you can appreciate what he's doing because you've done something similar yourself. That was an example that came to me. You may have your own examples of like seeing something, but then really experientially embodying it. So you really get the flavor of the embodied understanding. So this is where we are. We're gaining this really clear, deep, albeit initial understanding of our true nature. And we talk about true nature in Zen in a variety of ways. In fact, mostly we try not to talk about it at all, because it's hard to talk about in words. But I wanted to share these lines from a verse that comes from the tradition. This is from Master Hakuin's Song of Zazen. It's a wonderful verse that Master Hakuin put together in the 17th century that expresses his emotions and thoughts about the practice and the fruits of the practice. And if we turn inward and prove our true nature, that true self is no self, our own self is no self, we go beyond ego and past clever words. Then the gate to the oneness of cause and effect is thrown open. Not 2 and not 3, straight ahead runs the way. Our form now being no form, in going and returning, we never leave home. Our thought now being no thought, our dancing and songs are the voice of the Dharma. How vast is the heaven of boundless samadhi, how bright and transparent the moonlight of wisdom. What is there outside us? What is there we lack? Nirvana is openly shown to our eyes. This earth where we stand is the pure lotus land, this very body, the body of Buddha. So to see this true self as no self, to see it with the depth of understanding, that's what we call kensho, experiential insight into our true nature. And this is a radically different experience of yourself, very different from the way that you come to understand yourself as a person with qualities moving through time and even moving through space. And with this shift of a clear experiential understanding of true nature, you come to see that the personal drama that you've come to associate as yourself is extremely limited. It's just a surface story on top of a very rich manifold that is happening throughout space and time. Almost like a veil. So at this place, when we have this different experience of ourself, this is when our wisdom starts to function, because our wisdom comes from a dimension of ourself below the personal story. It comes from a deeper, fuller understanding of who we are. It comes from a direct appreciation of the oneness of the universe, and that includes you. So when we act from this place, the wisdom that arises from this place, we give to somebody in need, somebody on the street, a homeless person, without any sense of, I'm doing a good thing, without any kind of agenda to it or, calculation to it. It becomes your natural functioning to give to that person in need because you recognize they're just another aspect of yourself. So we meet our partners, our children in complete vulnerability without an agenda. There's no personal story that's getting in the way of that interaction. We feel in our own bodies that their happiness is our happiness, that their pain is our pain, and vice versa. We understand in our own bodies that we and the trees and the animals, even bacteria, even the insentient like rocks and teacups and bells, are all together one body. So in no self, we have a different experience of time and space. I read this in an essay from Ken Wilber. He said, the flight from death generates time, while the flight from unity generates space. I thought that was an interesting way to talk about what the wisdom traditions call samsara, conditioned existence. The flight from death is what generates our sense of time. Flight from unity is what generates our sense of space. That means linear time in three-dimensional space. So Ken shows the eruption of different experience of time and space. Because you can see from this description, it's these egoic flights, these aversions to death, and even an aversion to unity that's driving us into an egoic experience of reality. But if we see that true self is no self, that means that that egoic experience of reality is the whole picture. There's great power in this experience, and it comes through in the power of the ox. And we might even be resistant to this power. I think you might have asked yourself, our experience of space is generated by our flight from unity? Why would I fly from unity? Don't we all want unity? There might be something overwhelmingly powerful and overwhelmingly out of control about unity. To really find yourself to be one with all things. What great power is there? But the ego embraces its own limitations and its own sense of lack. It does. So you might ask, hearing the verses, I said at the beginning, why isn't this stage more of a relief? I've caught the ox. Shouldn't I be happier? Shouldn't this be joyful? Shouldn't this be a celebratory moment? Not so much as presented in this. It is true that our first bodily understanding of the insubstantiality of the self can be exhilarating. And if you ever read The Three Pillars of Zen or another of some descriptions of Zen practice or spiritual practice, sometimes you'll hear these accounts of these amazing breakthrough experiences, and people do have these kensho experiences, and then they're laughing and they're crying and they're exhilarated with the experience. And this is true, you know, it is incredibly exhilarating to really get, you know, what you've been hearing about in terms of the limitations of your own egoic personality, and to touch into the reality that that's not who you are, that you're much bigger. So that exhilaration is real. But that experience fades. And you do start to see that this whole project of spiritual practice is not a simple thing. That it involves great struggle and effort to catch the ox and then to tame the ox and to really master this matter of your true self. The verse says, its will is forceful. It's the ego wrestling with the power of no self. The ego puts up quite a fight. The conditioned self always comes back strong to reassert its view of the world, its view of who you are. Your wiring starts firing again. It would be great if that weren't the case. You sort of see something, you know, clearly, indisputable, undeniable. And then you don't go back asleep. You know, you don't kind of fall back into the old ways or the old habits. But let me ask you this. I bet everybody in here has had some profound synchronicity in your life. Something that's happened, like a coincidence, right? Or a synchronicity, where you said, this was not random. There's no way, you know, there's some deep, deep meaning here. Let me see a show of hands. How many people have had? Yeah, almost everyone. Okay. And in that moment, like when it really hits you, you're like, whoa, time and space is not what I think it is. There is a deeper order to the universe in some way. It's mysterious, I don't quite get it. But oh boy, you know, it's not just that. But then, you know, the next day, maybe you don't believe that so much. And then a week later, you've forgotten the whole thing happened. I've had these things happen to me. And then like 5 years later, somebody reminds me of it. I'm like, oh yeah, that was completely ludicrous. That was crazy. Things aren't limited to three-dimensional space and linear time. I mean, it's not true. So in the same way, you know, you can be completely, indisputably convinced that you're not the me story that you've thought you are. And yet, that self-sense comes slipping back and takes over. So in the verse it says, you know, there's straying and disappearing is what's happening. The ox is disappearing into the mist and dragging you places and straying off into places. That's your true self absenting itself from your consciousness, if you will, or your consciousness reacclimating itself to its old story. Right? The ego insists on being the seer, being the experiencer of your experience. The ego resists being seen by the non-judgmental witness that is consciousness. But when we have this experience, then we begin to transform our habits. So we do start to work in a different way and in a more real, substantial way with our habits, because now we do have this clear sense of the unconditioned dimension of our own consciousness. And we've got a better feel for how habit mind works and how egoic consciousness works. And as anybody knows who's tried to quit smoking or quit a bad habit or even to shift a habit, it's hard. You know, deeply embedded in our emotional bodies, our energetic bodies, our physical bodies. Habits are tough. So this gets at what Shoen was talking about last week in his talk on effort. You know, it takes effort to get out of the habit. It just does. You know, I like to think of the image of being, you're riding a bike and you're kind of caught in a gutter of some sort, right? You're tracked. You're just going track. It takes effort to actually turn the bike up over the hump and get out of the gutter, or the hill or the valley, whatever you want to call it. You get out, and then you get out, and now you've got freedom and free play. But you don't have that if you're already stuck. That's where the effort comes in. Our ingrained habits continue to propagate themselves, and they even spill over into our spiritual practice. And this is one of the perils of this stage. I've been talking about the specific perils of each of the stages. And in this one, our egoic identifications, our egoic self, if you will, may take on the experience that we've had of no self and have that be a badge for an experience, something special that now it adds to its wardrobe, its treasure box of experiences. This actually always happens. I mean, it's such a risk. Trungpa Rinpoche called it spiritual materialism. Yes, now you've got something, this experience, this quality. Right? That's what the ego tends to do. Any notion of specialness introduces an edge that the ego exploits. But as you work more and more with your true nature, which is no self, then you start to feel within yourself what real selflessness is. It's not up in the head. It's a real hard connection. And you start to be able to feel what real selflessness is in others too. You can feel it. It's not a calculation. This is where teachers come in crucially, is to help point out where yourself is taking on some of your experiences of no self and taking those on into its own ego defense project. And a teacher will point that out to you, a good teacher will. And I'm fortunate to have had two teachers who many, many times pointed out to me where I was doing that. And I did do it over many years. The self-sense is incorporating into the experience of no self into its own story. And teacher Joko Beck, who some of you know, Charlotte Joko Beck, she used to say when her students, you know, typically even some senior students, would kind of in a way put on an air of selflessness, if you will. Actually, hopefully it wasn't her senior students, maybe intermediate students. You know, kind of put on an air. She used to say to them, "Don't act so humble. You're not that good." You know, he gets at that. I'm so good, I can be this humble. We get inflated about our own insights. But despite our insight, this conditioning is still present. And in fact, we have a famous koan from the Zen tradition where the master asks, does an enlightened being transcend karmic consciousness? You know, you could say cause and effect. And because he says, yes, an enlightened being does transcend karmic consciousness, he's subjected to live the life of a fox for 500 lifetimes. And then he's released by the words of Master Hyakujo, who says, we cannot ignore karmic consciousness. Daido Loori says in his commentary on this stage of the Oxfording pictures, conditioning is fathomless. Fathomless. That's pretty deep. That's pretty deep. We're not going to get rid of that conditioning, but we can bring it to consciousness, and it takes true self, no self, to recognize. Because if it's the self that's engaging with the conditioning, you know, it's typically going to do so from an agenda or a story. So we keep plunging into no self over and over and over again. In the Song of Zazen, as preceding the lines that I quoted at the beginning, Hakuin says, how can we be freed from the wheel of samsara? The gateway to freedom is Zazen, Samadhi.